7 signs you've passed the most painful test of your soul. There are pains that leave marks on the body, and there are pains that go deeper. The kind that reshape the soul. The ones no one applauds you for surviving. The kind that happen quietly, behind closed doors, where prayers are whispered instead of shouted and tears fall without witnesses. You didn't post about it. You didn't explain it well. You just endured it. And there were moments when you wondered if God saw any of it at all. There was a season when everything familiar fell apart at the same time. Trust was shaken. Faith felt thin. Hope felt delayed. You kept going, not because you were strong, but because stopping felt even more terrifying. You asked questions you never thought you'd ask. You prayed prayers that didn't sound holy, just honest. And somehow, even when God felt silent, something within you refused to fully let go. The Bible speaks often about testing, refinement, and fire, not as punishment but as preparation. Yet no one really understands that truth while they're in the middle of it. When the soul is being tested, it feels less like growth and more like loss, less like purpose and more like abandonment. You don't realize you're being strengthened. You only feel stretched. You don't recognize transformation, you only notice what's breaking. But here's what's rarely said out loud. Some of the most painful tests of the soul don't end with a dramatic breakthrough. They end quietly. You wake up one day and realize something has shifted. The pain doesn't control you the way it used to. The memories don't cut as deep. The fear doesn't rule your decisions. You didn't become hardened, you became grounded, softer in compassion, stronger in discernment, calmer in faith. And maybe that's where you are now. Not fully healed, but no longer bleeding. Not untouched by pain, but no longer defined by it. Still believing, even if your faith looks different than it once did. If that's you, then this message is not about what you still need to survive. It's about what you've already made it through. Because according to Scripture, there are signs that reveal when the hardest test has already passed. Signs written not on the surface of your life, but deep within the posture of your soul. And if you recognize them, you may finally understand this truth: the season that nearly broke you may have already completed its work. Number 1, you no longer need to explain your pain to be at peace. There was a time when being misunderstood hurt almost as much as the pain itself. When you felt the need to explain what happened, to justify your reactions, to make people see how deeply you were affected. You replayed conversations in your mind, wishing you had said things differently, hoping someone would finally understand the weight you carried. Not for sympathy, but for validation, for acknowledgement that what you endured was real. But something changed. Now, the urge to explain has faded, not because the pain didn't matter, but because it no longer needs permission to be healed. You've reached a place where peace no longer depends on being understood by people who were never meant to carry your story. You've stopped placing your healing in the hands of human approval. This is not emotional numbness. It's maturity of the soul. According to the Bible, God sees what others miss. He understands what words fail to describe. When Scripture says that God examines the heart, it speaks to a level of knowing deeper than explanation. And once your soul has been refined through suffering, it learns a sacred truth. Not everyone needs to know what you went through in order for you to move forward. You still remember the pain. You haven't erased it, but it no longer controls your identity or your conversations. You don't rehearse it for new listeners. You don't carry it into every room. You don't need agreement to feel settled. That quiet confidence is not accidental. It means you've already processed the pain with God, not just with time. It means you've stopped seeking closure from people who couldn't give it, and started resting in the fact that God already witnessed everything. Every tear you wiped away alone. Every night you prayed in exhaustion. Every moment you stayed standing when it would have been easier to collapse. When the soul passes one of its hardest tests, it no longer begs to be seen. It knows it was seen all along. And if you recognize yourself here, calm without explanation, peaceful without validation. That's not weakness. That's evidence. Evidence that something inside you has already been healed at a depth most people never reach. Number 2. You forgave without receiving closure. There was a time when you waited for an explanation, an apology, a moment where the truth would finally be acknowledged and the weight of what happened would be named out loud. You told yourself that once that conversation happened, once the other person understood the damage they caused, you would finally be free to move on. But that moment never came. Or when it did, it was incomplete, defensive, or painfully empty. And yet, something unexpected happened. You forgave anyway. Not because the wound was small. Not because it didn't matter. And not because justice suddenly felt unnecessary. You forgave because carrying the anger became heavier than releasing it. You realized that waiting for closure was keeping you tied to a chapter God was already helping you leave. This kind of forgiveness doesn't come from personality or strength. It comes from a soul that has been stretched, its limit, and then met by God in the quiet. The Bible speaks of forgiveness not as a feeling, but as an act of obedience, one that frees the captive. And often, the captive isn't the one who hurt you. It's the one still holding the hurt. You didn't forget what happened. Forgiveness never means denial. You remember clearly. You just stopped allowing the memory to poison your spirit. You released the need for them to understand, to change, or to make things right in your time. You placed justice where it belongs, not in your hands, but in God's. And that decision didn't make you weaker. It made you lighter. You noticed how your thoughts became quieter, how resentment lost its grip, how your prayers no longer circled around the same wound. That's not emotional avoidance. That's spiritual authority. It's the sign of a soul that has already passed through deep refinement. When you forgive without closure, it means the hardest part of the test is already behind you. It means God healed you in a place people never reached. It means you chose freedom over fairness, peace over proof, obedience over revenge. And that choice, costly, unseen, and deeply biblical, is one of the clearest signs that your soul has already survived something profound. Number 3, you stopped begging God to remove the pain and started trusting what it produced. There was a season when your prayers sounded desperate, not poetic, not carefully worded, just raw pleas whispered through exhaustion. You asked God to take the pain away, to change the situation, to fix what felt unbearable. You counted the days, hoping relief would finally come. And when it didn't, doubt tried to creep in. You wondered if you were being ignored or if you were doing something wrong. But over time, your prayers changed. Not because the pain disappeared, but because your understanding deepened. You stopped begging God to end the suffering and began trusting that He was doing something within you through it. That shift didn't happen overnight. It came slowly through disappointment, through surrender, through the realization that God was still present even when the pain remained. The Bible is honest about this kind of transformation. Scripture never promises that faith removes every hardship, but it repeatedly shows that God uses hardship to refine, strengthen, and prepare His people. And when your soul reached the point where you could say, even quietly, I don't understand this, but I trust you, something fundamental changed inside you. You began to notice growth where you once saw only loss, patience where there was once panic, discernment where there was once confusion, a depth of faith that could not have been formed any other way. You didn't stop hurting, but you stopped fighting God in the middle of it. That's not surrender to pain. That's surrender to purpose. When the soul passes one of its hardest tests, it no longer demands immediate relief. It trusts God's timing more than its own comfort. It understands that what was meant to break you was used to build something stronger beneath the surface. And if you're here now, no longer pleading for escape, but quietly honoring what the process produced, that's not resignation. That's evidence of maturity. Evidence that the pain has already done its work, and that your soul has come through the fire refined, not destroyed. Number 4. You can sit alone without feeling empty. There was a time when silence felt dangerous, when being alone only made the pain louder and the thoughts heavier. You filled your days with noise, distractions, conversations, not because you were joyful, but because you were trying to outrun what you felt when everything went quiet. Loneliness wasn't just about people being absent. It was about feeling unseen, unsupported, and unsure of where God was in the middle of it all. But that changed. Now you can sit alone without feeling hollow inside. The room can be quiet. The phone can stay untouched. Your thoughts don't spiral the way they once did. Not because life is perfect, but because your soul has learned how to rest in God's presence instead of fearing the absence of people. This is one of the deepest signs of spiritual healing. The Bible shows again and again that God meets his people in isolation, not to punish them, but to shape them. In solitude, distractions fall away, and the soul learns where its true source of strength comes from. What once felt like abandonment becomes communion. You're no longer dependent on constant affirmation, attention, or emotional reassurance to feel whole. You don't measure your worth by who stays, who leaves, or who checks in. You've discovered that God's presence is not louder in a crowd and not weaker in silence. He is steady in both. That doesn't mean you don't value relationships. It means you're no longer ruled by the fear of losing them. You can enjoy people without clinging to them. You can be alone without feeling abandoned. When the soul passes one of its hardest tests, it stops confusing loneliness with emptiness. It learns the difference between being alone and being unsupported. And if you can now sit quietly, breathe deeply, and feel a calm assurance instead of panic, that's not emotional detachment. That's the peace that comes from knowing God stayed with you where no one else could, and that he's still there now. Number 5, you feel compassion instead of bitterness toward those who hurt you. There was a time when their name could change your mood instantly, when memories resurfaced without warning and tightened your chest. You replayed moments, words, decisions, wondering how someone could do that to you and walk away. Bitterness felt justified. Anger felt protective. It was the shield that helped you survive. But now, something is different. You don't excuse what they did. You don't minimize the damage. But instead of rage, you feel a strange, quiet compassion. You recognize brokenness where you once saw only cruelty. Weakness where you once saw only betrayal. Not because the pain was small, but because your heart has been healed enough to see clearly. This shift doesn't happen naturally. It's not human instinct. It's spiritual transformation. The Bible teaches that compassion flows from those who have been deeply comforted by God. When the soul has passed through suffering and found God faithful, it becomes harder to dehumanize others, even those who caused harm. You understand that hurt people often hurt people, and while that truth doesn't justify sin, it frees you from carrying hatred that no longer belongs to you. You no longer wish for revenge. You no longer rehearse their failure in your mind. You don't need them to suffer for you to feel whole, and that doesn't make you naive, it makes you free. Compassion is not weakness. It's evidence that bitterness no longer owns your heart. It means God healed you deeply enough that your pain didn't turn you cold. It refined you instead of hardening you. If you can look back now and feel empathy where anger once lived, that's not something you forced. That's something God completed. It's a sign that your soul didn't just survive the test, it was transformed by it. Number 6, you're no longer afraid of being broken again. At one point, fear shaped everything. Fear of loss, fear of disappointment, fear of trusting the wrong person or hoping too deeply. After what you went through, it felt safer to stay guarded, distant, emotionally closed. You told yourself it was wisdom, and maybe for a while it was. But now, fear doesn't have the same power. You understand something you didn't before. Being broken didn't destroy you. It revealed what truly held you together. You learned that even when everything fell apart, God remained. Even when you were at your weakest, you were not abandoned. And that knowledge changed the way you face the future. You're not reckless. You're discerning. You don't rush into everything, but you don't live hiding either. You know pain is possible, but you also know survival is proven. You've already walked through the worst season of your soul and came out with your faith intact, even if it looks different now. The Bible speaks of a courage that doesn't come from avoiding suffering, but from enduring it. And when the soul passes one of its hardest tests, it stops living in self-protection mode. It understands that God doesn't promise a pain-free life. He promises His presence in every season. So you no longer build your life around fear. You make room for love again, for hope, for calling. Not because you believe nothing bad will happen, but because you know nothing can separate you from God if it does. That confidence is quiet, grounded, unshakable. And if you recognize this strength in yourself, calm instead of panic, courage instead of avoidance, it's because your soul has already been tested, and it passed. Number 7. You carry a quiet strength that doesn't need recognition. There was a time when you needed reassurance that you were growing, that your faith was real, that the suffering meant something. You looked for signs in people's words and outcomes in visible progress. You wanted confirmation that you hadn't endured all that pain for nothing. Now, you don't need it the same way. There is a steadiness in you that doesn't announce itself. You don't feel the urge to prove how strong you are, how spiritual you've become, or how much you've survived. You show up. You stay faithful. You keep going. Not loudly, not dramatically, but consistently. And that quiet strength speaks louder than validation ever could. This kind of strength is formed in private places, in moments when no one was watching, in prayers whispered with shaking hands, in decisions to keep choosing faith when doubt would have been easier. The Bible often describes God's work as something hidden before it is revealed, and those who have passed the deepest tests of the soul often carry the least need to be seen. You don't compare your journey to others anymore. You're not threatened by someone else's progress or platform. You know where God met you. You know what He carried you through, and that knowing gives you peace. This is spiritual authority, not the kind that demands attention, but the kind that stands firm without it. It's the sign of a soul that has already been validated by God in the fire of suffering. If this feels familiar, it's because you've already crossed a threshold. You didn't just endure pain, you were shaped by it. And you emerged with a strength that doesn't need applause to exist. Conclusion. Some seasons of life don't end with celebration, they end with clarity. You don't always notice the moment the test is over. There's no announcement, no dramatic shift. Just a quiet realization that you're no longer who you were when the pain began. The weight doesn't press the same way. The fear doesn't rule the same way. The wounds no longer define your direction. According to the Bible, God never wastes suffering. Every tear, every delay, every unanswered prayer was part of a refining process your soul needed, even if it didn't make sense at the time. And if these signs resonate with you, it may be because the hardest part is already behind you. Not because life is easy now. Not because pain will never return, but because your soul has learned where its strength truly comes from. You've learned how to trust God without guarantees, how to stand without constant reassurance, how to carry peace even when circumstances remain uncertain. That means you're not waiting for healing, you're walking in it. You're not stuck in survival, you're stepping into purpose. And whatever God has ahead of you will be built on the resilience, compassion, and faith that were forged in the season that nearly broke you. If you've made it this far, take a breath. The test did not destroy you. It prepared you. And the same God who carried you through it is still walking with you now. Quietly, faithfully, and with a future shaped by grace.